watching this free video tutorial from mographplus.com. Please make sure to visit our website and check out our premium courses for Cinema 4D, 3ds Max, Arnold, V-Ray, Maxwell, motion graphics, and much more. And also please make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Vimeo to enjoy our free video tutorials. Okay folks, in this section we talk lights and lighting in VRAYforC Cinema 4D. If you go to your V-Ray Bridge menu, you can see you have this lights menu, and here you can see all the lights that you have available. And you have your V-Ray physical sun and sky, and then you have your V-Ray area rectangular, dome, sphere, mesh, disk. These are basically the area lights, and the physical sky, physical sun and sky are the most important lights that you're going to be using them most of the time. But besides them, you have some kind of secondary lights like parallel light, ambient light, IS light, spotlight, and omni-light. In this particular lesson, I'm going to be taking a look at V-Ray area rectangle light, which is probably the most important light and the light that you're going to be using most of the time. And you also have we're going to be talking about V-Ray sphere and disk light as well. So let's create a V-Ray area rectangle light. Before that, let me just quickly walk you through the scene. As you can see, this is a very simple scene. We have this floor and we have this kind of concrete material applied to. We have this alarm clock with some materials here that you can check them out, and a physical camera that if I go to its tag, you can see it has a neutral, white balance, an ISO of 1200, a shutter speed of 100, and f-stop of 8. So that's what we have in the scene right now. And this null object that's called target, and it is in the same location as our clock. So we're going to be using this to control the lights and how they are going to be positioned in our scene. So let's create a V-Ray area rectangle light from our V-Ray Bridge menu. And there you have it. Now let me just get out of this camera here and start. One of the things actually I like to do with my lights, especially when working with VRAYforC Cinema 4D, is to select the light itself and disable this show illumination option. So you can see actually we need to have it on because it's gonna also hide the rectangle itself, not only the decay, but it doesn't really matter in this case. So first of all, select the tag and let's go to something like 25 and 25, and let me position the light. Just to make it a bit easier, what we can do, as I mentioned, just right click on the light Cinema 4D tags and add a target tag, and now define this null, which is in the same position as of our clock, as the target object. So there you go. And now we can select the light itself and start positioning it the way we want. Let's see. So probably something like that wouldn't be too. Let's see. Okay. So that's probably good enough. Let me get back to my camera. Now that we have our light positioned correctly, I'm going to my render settings and enable material override. So now we're going to be rendering with a simple grayscale VRAYforC Cinema 4D advanced material instead of the current material that we have. And I do that all the time when I'm kind of testing out the lights, just to make sure everything is going to be fast. So now I can go ahead and run V-Ray IPR. Let me just disable this VFB option in the IPR. So we're just going to be rendering in this interactive progressive render window. And you need to adjust so it will kind of match the resolution that you have in your scene. Something like that, probably going to be enough. Let me also restart the IPR. There we go. Okay. Now let's select the V-Ray area light tag and see what we have here. Now in the common tab, the first option we have is the light type. We have omni light, spotlight, infinite light, area light, parallel light, and ambient light. In this case, we have an area light, and the area light type is set to rectangle, right? So Next, we have the most important parameter, which is intensity. And as I increase the intensity, as you can see, the light gets obviously brighter. Let's go to something like 50 maybe. So there you go. And this value basically controls the light intensity and brightness. In the intensity units section, we can control the units by which the intensity of the light will be controlled. By default, it's set to this default image, which is a generic unit, and it really doesn't mean anything. You increase this value, you get a brighter light. You decrease this value, you get a darker light. One thing that's really important when using the default image unit is the fact that in this particular unit, the size of the light basically relate to its brightness, right? Right now, if I go ahead and actually increase the size of the light from 25 centimeters to something like 50 centimeter, you can see not only we get a diffuser shadow because we have a bigger light source, we also get a brighter scene. So if I go to something like 10 and 10, we get darker light, but we also get a sharper shadow. But if I go to, for example, a lumen's power or lumen unit, in this particular unit, we don't have that dependency right now. If I decrease the size of my light to something like 50, the intensity of the light doesn't change based on its size. But when we actually increase or decrease the light size, we can see only the shadows get diffuser or sharper. So when something like 20, we get a sharper shadow, but when we increase the light size, we get diffuser shadow, right? Now, when we are using the radiant power or watts, in this unit also the size and the intensity of the light do not depend on each other. But when using the lumens per square meter per sterdian or watts per square meter per sterdian, the light size and its intensity depend on one another. I particularly and personally like to use watts when actually dealing with VRAYforC Cinema 4D lights. So in this case, let's set the radiant power to something like watts and maybe something like 10. Okay. And the light size, maybe something like 16 and 16, just to get a bit more diffuser shadow. Maybe I can go to something like 1626. So now if I just stop this and get out of this camera, we have a bit more of a rectangle compared to the square shaped light that we had before. So size X is set to 16 centimeter and size Y is set to 26 centimeter, right? And the radiance power is set to 10 right now. And this is the lighting that we get. Okay. Let's run the IPR again. Now you can control the overall intensity using a texture if you wanted to, but this is not where you actually define a texture. For example, if you want your light to be like a softbox and apply a softbox texture to your light, this is not where you do it. In the area light tab, there is this texture section. This is the place to apply those textures. We're going to be talking about that later on in this lesson. We have cutoff threshold, and this is a threshold below which the effect of the light won't be calculated. Right now, if I go to a higher value, like let's say 0.5, and run the IPR, you can see this point where you can see as I'm increasing this value, let's say to 0.6, this threshold is getting closer and closer to the light source itself. So when the threshold is below this value that we specify here, the effect of the light won't be calculated, as you can see it here. So let's get back to default value, which is 001. And in this section, you control the color of the light. We have the ability to select any specific light that we want, right? Or we can use different presets like a cool white, fluorescent or quartz, or you can see you have everything that you want. Just some ready preset that you probably don't use them that much, but they are there if you wanted to. And if you want to use a Kelvin value instead of these RGB values, you can see you can use Cinema 4D's color picker to do that. So if I want to have maybe a warmer light source, I can use a Kelvin value like 4500 to achieve that. But in this case, let me just get back to a simple white color. All right. Then we have texture, and here you can use a texture instead of a color to be used as the color of your light. Now, next we have effect diffuse and effect specular, and here you control how the light basically affects the diffuse and specular portions of the V-Ray materials. So if I just stop this and get back to my render settings and disable material override so we can actually see our materials in the scene and run the IPR again. Okay. Now effect diffuse controls whether the light affects the materials diffuse contribution or not. So if I just disable it, you can see the light only affects the specular and reflection contribution, and if I enable it, the light start to affect the diffuse portion of the material as well. And the diffuse contribution controls how much the light will affect the diffuse portion of the material. So for example, if I go to something like 0.5, the effect will be divided in half. So let's get back to 1. And we have effect specular, which controls whether the light affects the specular contribution of the material or not. So if I enable it or disable it, you can see how it affects the render. There you go. We can still see the reflection of the light on our surface and on our subject, and that's because effect reflection on their area light tab is enabled. So if I disable this, you can see the light no longer is visible in the reflection, right? So let me turn on effect specular. Down here we have enable shadows, which if enabled, you can see the light cast shadows, and if I disable it, the light no longer casts shadows. There you go. And let me just stop the IPR and just to have a faster feedback, enable material override again and run the IPR. We have shadow color, which can be used to define any specific color for your shadows that you want. And these options, like something like shadow color, for example, is not available in something like VRAYforC4D 3.4 Max. They're just more physical, but here you get that artistic control to control and basically decide what is the color of your shadows in your scene if you want to have a specific color for any reason. But it should be black for most cases, and if you want to, you can use any texture to be used as your color shadow or shadow color. In this case, let me just use something like maybe a Burcon noise. And I'm gonna get in there, maybe go to a size like 1. I'm gonna stop the IPR for a moment and run it again. You can actually restart or update the IPR if you want to, but you can see now the noise is actually appearing on the shadow color, and instead of that black color, we are using this noise pattern to define our shadow color, right? So let's get back to the light and clear this. Then we have this shadow bias. This parameter basically moves the shadows closer or further away from the shadow casting object, and it hasn't been working quite in the VRAYforC Cinema 4D version of V-Ray, but it's not an important option. It's not a physically accurate option. You should leave it alone and don't play around with it, but maybe something like 5 cm. It's supposed to move the shadows kind of maybe closer or further away from the shadow casting object. In this case, I'm just going to reset it to default. We have these two values, shadow radius and shadow subdivisions, and as you can see, they are grayed out. These two are basically non-area light related option. In this case, we have an area light and they are grayed out because we control the shadow, how diffuse or sharp the shadows are based on the size of the lights when we have an area light, right? But if you are using a non-area light, like let's say an omni light, let's just change this to an omni light, and let me just also, okay. Now, as you can see, the shadow radius and shadow subdivisions become available. Right now, the shadow radius is set to 0 and we get these very sharp shadows. But if I go ahead and actually increase the shadow radius to, let's say, something like 10 centimeters, now we can clearly see how the shadow is getting diffuser compared to when it was 0, right? And we have these shadow subdivisions, which controls the quality of the shadow. So if you increase it, you are going to get a cleaner and smoother shadows, and if you decrease it, you are going to get noisier shadows. But one thing that I want to talk about just very quickly, the subdivision values, the local subdivision values, like for example this value here, or if I just change my light back to area light and go to its area light tab, you can see the subdivision value here. These local subdivision values that you see in the light tags or in the materials, they are not working like they were working in VRAYforC Cinema 4D 1.9. So in this release, in VRAYforC Cinema 4D 3.4, the local subdivision values are not effective by default. You need to tell VRAYforC Cinema 4D that I want to use these local subdivision values. By default, VRAYforC Cinema 4D decides the subdivision value that it's going to use for your lights and materials. And if you go to your render settings, you can see in the anti-aliasing tab, if you want to actually use this local subdivision values, you need to enable use local subdivision values. I just really don't want to confuse you, but this is how it works, and we're going to be talking about this values in the image sampling section of the course. But by default, these values, these local subdivision values are not effective in this release. But generally, increasing the subdivision values are going to get you higher quality and less noisy results compared to decreasing them, right? And we have these photon subdivisions and caustic subdivisions, and we talk about them when we actually discuss caustic's effect. And we have this beam radius and decay options that are again related to non-area lights, basically, and we are going to be talking about these options when we actually talk and discuss some other light types. Now, in the area light section, obviously the first thing you have is area type. You can choose a rectangle, a sphere, a dome, or a mesh, and down here you have this also disc shape option. So if you want to have a, let me quickly create control drag and create a copy of this camera and move it around so I can see my light source here, right? And if I just press play here, you can see, if I get back to the light tag, the light source, it's set to rectangle and we get this rectangular shape. I can change it to a sphere, and now we have this sphere, right? So if I just move around, and you can see the IPR here, we basically have this sphere as our light source, right? Let's get back to this view here, and let's see, change this to rectangle. And if you have, if you want, you can enable this disc shape option. Now you get a disc shape, and size X and Y now will be controlling the radius of this disc. In this case, let me just disable them. Okay, we have size X and Y, which obviously controls the overall. Let me change this to 16 and 26. Okay, we have effect reflections, which if I get back to my main camera here and also enable disable material override here and restart my IPR. Now we have effect reflections, and when disabled, you can see the reflection of the light won't be visible on the surface. You only see the speculars. We have invisible, and if I enable this option, let me get back to my second camera again, you can see the light source is not visible, but you can see it's still visible in the reflection and refraction and stuff like that. But if you wanted to, you can make it invisible. We have subdivision, which controls the overall quality of the light, and we talked about this. We have no decay, and as you can see by default, the surfaces that are closer to the light source are a lot brighter compared to the surfaces that are further away from the light source, and that's called decay. And if I enable no decay, now we don't have that effect anymore, and as you can see, no matter where is the surface compared to the light source, they're getting the same intensity, and that's not a physically accurate effect, but if you wanted to, you can have it. And we have the store with irradiance map, and when this option is enabled and you are using irradiance map as your primary GI engine, the effect of the light will be calculated and stored with the irradiance map, and that's gonna result in a faster render time, but it's gonna just make the lights, the shadows that cast by the lights, less detailed and less kind of visible. And this is very visible for your secondary lights if you want to have them in your scene, but you don't want to cause any increase in your render time or a slight increase in your render time. You can actually have this option enabled for them. We have this double-sided option. You can see by default, if I just move here to, let's say, an angle like this, you can see the light source is only is one-sided. The back side of the light source is black, and if I enable the double-sided option here, you can see both the front and the back side are casting light. So that's for here. Let me disable this. We have the light portal, we have the normal light, portal light, and simple portal light. We are going to be talking about that in our next lesson. It's kind of related to interior scenes and stuff like that, and we're going to be covering that in our next lesson. And we have this ignore light normals, and if you disable it, basically the light will take into consideration the normal direction of the surface when it's actually casting the light. So more light will be cast in the direction of the normals, right, of your light source, obviously. Okay, let me maybe get back to the camera here. Okay, now we have this light rectangle options. The first option is directional, and by default is set to 0. And if I increase this value, as I'm increasing this, the lights basically start to be more focused and more directional. So at something like 1, you can see the light becomes very, very directional. And there you go. So if you want to make your light more focused or achieve any dramatic effect, you can increase the directional value of your rectangle light, right? And we talked about the disc shape, and here is the use texture. So let's say I want to have a softbox type of light source. Let me just enable the use texture, and there is a very specific texture that does exactly that. If you go to your VRAY bridge shaders and go to your VRAY, where it is, VRAY power shaders, and let me just stop this and quickly create our softbox. Now in this VRAY power shader, you can define and select between a lot of specific VRAY shaders. In this case, if you go to the fall off and gradients, we have this softbox option, and if you enable frame on, let me just make sure it's not that. There you go, something like that, probably. Just adjusting the gradient, and also let's see, a horizontal gradient. Let's see, that's a radial, that's a horizontal, that's a vertical gradient, but in this case we're just going to use our horizontal gradient, and probably just adjust the gradient a tad. So maybe something like this, and also adjust the frame. Okay, that's nice. And now if I just get to my second camera so I can see the actual light source, we should be able to see that. Let me just run the IPR. Now let's see. Use texture is enabled, and if I just decrease the radiance power, we should be able to actually see that softbox effect on our light source. Let's see, go to something like 0.2. Now you can clearly see that softbox effect, but we obviously want to see that softbox effect on our reflections. And if you take a look at the reflections, you can see the reflections are softer on the edges, and that's because the softbox that we used in here, right? And obviously you have this resolution value and adaptiveness that aren't really that important. And the resolution value, you kind of want to, if you are using a specific external texture, you want to have your resolution kind of be the exact as the texture resolution to kind of increase the speed of your render and just avoid any headaches and noise problems. But in this case we are using a softbox, and the resolution really doesn't matter that much, especially for what we call multiple important sampling and kind of having the secondary lights find the light source a bit easier. But in this case it really doesn't matter that much. So that's about area light in VRAY4 Cinema 4D. Let's just go ahead and work on the lighting a bit. What I'm gonna do is probably select my first camera and just adjust the okay. Now you can basically close this lesson, but I want to add a few more lights and finish the lighting of the scene quickly. So we have this light, and what I want to do is to go to the top view and control drag, put it on the left side, maybe to something like here. Okay, also let me just get out of the camera for now, and this is our light. Select the light and make it something like 80. Just want to have a very visible reflection on the glass of our clock, so something like this hopefully will work. Let's get back to the camera here. Okay, and run the IPR. So here is our second light starting to affect, and let's see, probably want the light to be let's turn off our first light for now. Okay, and now our second light, let's see how it will show up in the reflections. That's not too bad, probably just a tad to right. Okay, that's good. And I'm going to decrease its intensity to something like 2 watts. I don't want it to be that overpowering. And this is our first light. And as you can see, having our secondary light will start to brighten up the shadows that are cast by our first light. And obviously the final thing I want to do is just to add a dome light, and dome light is basically a virtual sky that we're going to be talking about it in a future lesson, but in this case I'm just going to add a light, and you need to add a V-Ray dome light, and that's, let's actually name them. That's our main light, that's our fill light, and that's okay, that's our dome light, right? And here you need to go to the area light tab. As you can see, it's just an area light with the area type set to dome. enable spherical dome and use texture, and let's use this HDRI that you have in your text folder, this one. And one of the things that I want to actually make sure you understand, always use V-Ray advanced bitmap instead of just loading it using a Cinema 4D bitmap. So to convert that, simply go to your V-Ray shaders and use V-Ray advanced bitmap. And now we have this here. Just want to make it less saturated, so we can go to our color correction tab, enable this, and let's decrease the saturation by 25%, so -25, something like that. Okay, that's cool. Let's run the IPR again and see what we have. Okay, so obviously we need to decrease the intensity of this light, maybe to something like 0.3. Okay, I think that's good enough, maybe 0.25. Okay, so there you have it. And finally, what I want to do, just select the camera and go to the sampling tab and enable depth of field. Nothing too specific. We can go ahead and actually adjust our f-stop to get a bit more specific depth of field effect, but in this case, f-stop of 8 would be enough. And in the render settings, I'm just going to define an output 1200 by 1200. In the V-Ray bridge section, let's enable VFB window, change these progressive to bucket in this case, and 120.01 DMC sampler, indirect illumination brute force. In this case, I'm just going to irradiance map just to have a faster render, and light cache, let's increase this to something like 1000 subdivisions. And it should be enough for this particular render. Now, before actually going through with the final render, one thing I want to check is the, if I get back to my camera, I have, make sure the camera has the right focus distance here. So I'm going to select the camera and make sure it's actually, focus distance is right on the clock here, right? Perfect. And let me just quickly run the IPR and stop this. Get a smaller window size here. And now I just want to make sure to use an f-stop, maybe something like, let's say 12 or probably 16. Now we need to compensate by either increasing our shutter speed to something like 1600, or let's say decreasing the shutter speed to something like, 50 here. We're going to be talking about V-Ray physical camera obviously in detail, but that's probably not too bad for now. Just going to stop this, and we can obviously adjust and color correct our render after it's done. Also, before starting the final render, I would like to actually add a V-Ray denoiser pass as always. So let's go to our V-Ray multipass manager, and in the special channels, add a denoiser pass. Make sure only generate render elements, change this to store denoise result in separate element, and change the type to single pass denoise on RGB only for this particular render and preset to mild. Let's start the render and see what we get. Okay guys, so here is our final render. Here is our RGB pass and here is our denoiser pass. Right, let me also enable my correction controls, and probably the first thing I want to do is to enable my exposure and just add a tad of exposure, something like that, and go to my white balance, add a bit warmer tones to the overall render, and in the curves maybe add some contrast. Okay, so okay, there you have it. Here is our final render for this lesson. And in this lesson we talked about area light in its rectangular, sphere and disc shape, and we'll continue discussing area lights in the next lesson with portal lights, dome lights, and also mesh lights. So see you there. Thank you for watching this free video tutorial from mographplus.com. Please make sure to visit our website and check out our premium courses for Cinema 4D, 3ds Max, Arnold, V-Ray, Maxwell, motion graphics, and much more. And also please make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Vimeo to enjoy our free video tutorials.